one of the things that makes the book so brilliant is that the nonsense is so logical. That is, everyone can deduce an argument for what they're doing, even though what they're doing is absurd. So when Alice sits down at the Mad Hatter's tea party and they ask her if she'd like more tea, and she says she can't have any more as she hasn't had any yet. The reply is, what you mean is you can't have any less.
Joining me today is the singular David Bentley Hart, and I'm grateful for his time and his work over the years. And thank you for joining us to discuss animals in literature today. David, how are you?
I'm well enough. How are you?
I am quite well. It is still bitter winter hanging on to spring here in the Pacific Northwest, but we'll get through it.
In the upper Midwest at the moment for my sins, and so I'm not impressed. Yeah. This wind coming off the Great Lakes is a foretaste of hell for those of us who might have a berth booked there.
Indeed. Well, I'm still paying my penance and probably have decades still to go for that. I'd love to just explore briefly before we dive into the works of Lewis Carroll, your own experience and love of literature over the years, and maybe your childhood, how you came to appreciate its meaning and importance in the world.
I mean, that goes back farther, I think, than conscious memory will take me. I've just always lived in a fairly bookish world, from a bookish family, and it was the literary arts that more than anything else attracted and delighted me, although music and the other arts as well have their place in my life. So I don't know. I don't really have an origin story there. I think the moment I entered consciousness, I was already aware of being read to, and began reading without any conscious transition from the pre-literate to the literate state. So.
Like a fish in water or bird in the air, as it were.
I think also that it helps that the children's books I was exposed to at an early age were things like the Alice books or The Wind in the Willows or Winnie the Pooh, books that have a literary merit to them far in excess of mere entertainments for children.
That makes sense. I had a lovely conversation with Landon Lofton on The Wind in the Willows earlier in this series, and learned a few things there, and expecting to learn many things here today. Before entertaining Alice, though, a few years back, I came across your work, Rollin and Moonlight, and fascinating, sometimes perplexing, often enchanting. But I'm curious how that came about for you.
That book?
Yes.
Well, almost by accident. I had written a few Roland columns. Just isolated columns. And a publisher of the small independent press, Angelico, John Reese, got in touch with me and said, would you ever think of writing a book or putting together a book of Roland writings? And I think he was expecting something like a slim volume of 200 pages or so, and just conversations with my dog. And that's probably what I was thinking when I said yes to it. But then as I was writing it, I realized it was the book that was probably closest to a exact expression of my personality and my interests and my sense of humor and my love of animals and of so many other things. And it became for me a book of everything. I realized that I could turn it into something more. So it evolved almost under its own momentum. It more or less chose for itself the way it was going. As I say, at first it was going to be a small and divertly small, But then it had its own logic to it, and I'm glad John suggested it to me, because the truth is, I don't think I could write another book that is as meaningful to me, or into which I could put as much of myself.
Yeah, it definitely shows. And as you're describing that, I think about how it is that with our pets, it seems we're most honest. Would you agree with that?
Yes, because we really don't have to hide anything from them, sorry. And as Roland himself explains at great length in one chapter in the book, their reliance on the olfactory makes it impossible for us to deceive them, because we can hide behind a false expression or false words or false tone of voice, but our fragrance gives us away. They can tell if we're lying or if we're being evasive.
Yes. It reminds me, in a previous life, I practiced law, and I had a client whose organization trained service dogs to smell people who were about to encounter diabetic shock. Fascinating creatures and incredible gifts to us all. I'm
And then, of
curious.
course, there
Go
is
ahead.
their unarguable moral superiority to us. I mean, dogs and cats both, but dogs perhaps a bit more. I mean, they're a bit more self-effacing and self-giving, but yes.
Yes. Would you like to speak any more to that?
No, because I'll just get sentimental. I start thinking of all the pets I've had in my life and have passed away, and it's been about going on 2 years since Roland himself passed away, and I still miss him keenly. But then again, I still miss pets I lost 45 years ago. So it's just like anyone else you love. It stays with you when they depart.
It truly does. Well, thank you for being willing to share about that. I'm curious, you talked about sort of that transition from pre-literate to literate life in your own existence, and perhaps there is and perhaps there isn't, but do you have a encounter with Lewis Carroll that stands out in your memory or recollection?
No, I mean, Lewis Carroll was there from the beginning. Everyone in my family loved Lewis Carroll, loved the Alice books, The Hunting of the Snark, the Nonsense Verse. I don't think any of us was ever won over entirely by the Sylvia and Bruno books, but no one else other than the French ever has been. So, but yeah, and I was the youngest in the family, so I arrived into a world in which Lewis Carroll was simply part of the basic architecture of meaning in all things, and it was also, of course, was born in 1965, so my sentimental education really began taking off in the 1970s, and as it happens, that was a period when there was a great Lewis Carroll revival going on. It was, and so every Christmas, I'd receive like a chess set made of pieces modeled on the Tenniel illustrations from Through the Looking Glass, or soaps or special, and my father secured copies for us of the autograph versions of Alice's Adventures Underground, the original text he wrote after he made up the story for Alice Little. And that was before it was widely available. He just happened to have access to it, be it through business connections, regarding the new technology of photocopying or something. I don't know how that happened. The Wasp in the Wig, a missing part of Through the Looking Glass, was published. So it was actually just never, there's no first moment for me. I mean, Lewis Carroll was there before I was there to myself.
Well, shall we dive into the Wonderland?
Yep.
All right.
I'm willing to, for the 20 trillionth time in my life.
Well, it's the first for me doing so with you. So thank you for your good humor and patience as I ask probably quite mundane questions. The White Rabbit, perpetually late, obsessed with time. What is so captivating about him, and perhaps what does his time fixation tell us or symbolize in the world?
Well, I don't think it symbolizes anything. I mean, good writers don't write in symbols, and great writers especially don't. But although there are two senses of symbol, if by symbolize we mean this stands in as a kind of pictorial allegory for that, so there's a one-to-one correspondence, definitely it means nothing. It's just funny, it's silly, it's delightful. If you're using the category of the symbolic, more as, say, the French symbolists did, André Breton, Robert Deneau, there's not a one-to-one correspondence between an idea and its symbol. Rather, there's a sort of use of the sort of symbolic grammar of dreams and the way one flows into another according to its own logic rather than the sort of the logic of strict causality of waking life. And in that sense, you could say there's a symbolic structure to the books in that they are dream books, and so the images flow. But I think the principal thing you should take, first of all, is to laugh. Rabbit, who are famously jittery, timid creatures, always hastening off if you approach them. That would be a child's experience of it, and it's amusing to make him, give him a waistcoat and a watch, and that he's dashing off because he's late for something that's a very important date. And and then there's the larger reality of Wonderland in both books, there and on the other side of the looking glass, which is that it's all seen through the eyes of a child who lives in a world in which she's surrounded by adults who are doing things and saying things that are utterly absurd and unintelligible, but which they regard as the very substance of rationality. And she has to treat it like that, because being a little girl, that's the way the whole adult world always appears to her. I mean, to a child, there doesn't seem to be any real rationale for most of what adults are doing, or for what they're saying, or for how imperious they can be. So you may notice that a lot of the characters in the books are very rude, because, to be honest, people are very rude to children. Unthinkingly so. I don't know if that means it symbolizes or represents anything as such, but that's what I take from it.
Yes. How poignant it is to be reminded that we are so often quite rude to them. And
it's actually quite astonishing. We can be very loving and very tender and but quite often adults can be oddly peremptory and speak to children in ways that they wouldn't think of speaking to a stranger, another adult. So, and I don't mean just when they're scolding the children. I mean when they're just being inconsiderate.
Yes. You're disrupting my significantly more important thing that I am focused on as an adult, right?
Yes. Go play with your sister.
Well, yes, mine are all adults now, but hopefully I did okay a couple of times with that. The Cheshire cat claims that we're all mad here and disappears, only leaving its grin. Is there just whatever you want to tell me about the Cheshire cat?
Well, again, I mean, I think that's right. To a small child, everything that we do is somewhat inscrutable. And so it's good for the Cheshire cat to say, well, it's because we're all mad here, And of course, everyone is mad, let's say is irrational in Wonderland. Again, I don't think the way to approach the books, and I would say this about most books worth reading, is to look for their meaning, so much as to dwell in their effect. And then you see the coherence of this incoherence. The Cheshire cat is saying something that's very true about the world of adults. Not only as it appears to a child, there's that, but maybe at a deeper level, it's true anyway. That the children perhaps have a somewhat more rational perspective on this, because they haven't spent so many years accumulating reasons for doing irrational things and convincing themselves that they're a rational thing.
I really appreciate the admonition to dwell in its effect. I think perhaps, this is my estimation, it's a product of the age that everything must be deconstructed and systematized. And perhaps I've fallen prey to that even in approaching this text.
Well, actually, though, I mean, you have to be careful with the word deconstruction, because, of course, it actually, as a philosophical project, as a correction of, say, structuralism or certain movements in phenomenology, is meant to do away with the systematic premises with which we tend to. It's precisely the opposite, say, no, stop looking for a central governing meaning that can be controlled either by the author or the reader. I think it's more the case that it's an analytic prejudice of our age, that we live in the age of suspicion in one sense. That is, we come after the time of Darwin and Marx and Freud and others who would tell us that behind the manifest surface of things, there's a secret world that is contrary to appearances, that rather than saving appearances, we've learned to distrust the appearances. And so, Darwinism, I don't mean just the notion of evolution or special evolution. I mean a certain sort of tendency within the school of Darwinism to see everything that appears, and you see this especially in evolutionary psychology, everything that appears to be altruistic, to actually merely to be the phylogenetic residue of a deeper selfishness, of a will to exist. Or Freud telling us that this dream imagery, this sort of symbolic flow of dream imagery that I was talking about, actually conceals. It's like a palimpsest. If you could remove the first layer or even the second layer of the dream imagery, you'll get back to a very specific meaning. This has to do with certain rather nasty desires you have with regard to your mother, and so your superego tries to suppress them. And yeah. And with Marx too. I mean, that you look about the structures of society and community and say, well, these are perennial realities. But the Marxist impulse, again, these are all healthy impulses at some level if they don't get out of control, is to say, well, actually, there are material conditions and discourses of power, or in Gramsci's terms, of hegemony, that are really operating unseen. So I think that's just the temper we come to everything with now. We live in an analytic, not a deconstructive, but an analytic state of mind and of expectation most of the time. And yes, sometimes we employ deconstruction in that way too. It seems to be saying one thing, but really it's just, phallogocentric Western hegemony that's actually expressing itself. And I think that's, that's a problem. I mean, I don't think the arts ought to be reduced to a secondary or parasitic discourse or a dissemblance of a deeper truth. I actually believe that the arts have a transcendental horizon of their own, the beautiful or the delightful or the amusing. Well, one of the reasons I reduce, say, the Alice, I would resist, reading the Alice books as symbolic palimpsests of that kind, is because I think whimsy is its own rationale. It's, the books are hilarious. I mean, the absurdity is inspired at a level of genius.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that clarification and correction for me. That's very helpful. And reminds me to be very prudential with the use of my terms. I can't help but note that perhaps that whimsy is a mild antidote to being overly analytical. Is that a fair assessment?
I would say a radical antidote. That you'll enjoy the Alice books best when you realize that you should just be enjoying them. Now, that's not to say you can't come up with clever a book I love by someone I knew, the British philosopher, although he lived in the United States for most of his later professional career, Peter Heath, The Philosopher's Alice, is a great read, in part because, of course, Lewis Carroll was a logician. One of the things that makes the book so brilliant is that the nonsense is so logical. That is, everyone can deduce an argument for what they're doing, even though what they're doing is absurd. So when Alice sits down at the Mad Hatter's tea party and they ask her if she'd like more tea, and she says she can't have any more as she hasn't had any yet, the reply is, what you mean is you can't have any less. And of course, yeah, so there is an austere logical precision there, but it's hilarious because, of course, in the context, it's also utterly silly and absurd. So
Yeah, and so much wordplay. And the one that comes to mind is even with the letters with the caterpillar and the sort of, for me anyway, infamous question to Alice, "Who are you?" Uh, and one of the things that I think is a potential
famous,
danger.
infamous or famous? It doesn't seem very infamous to me, but famous.
Yes,
Yes.
well, this is fun. I love vocabulary words, and so having you correct me on my word usage is
Just
fantastic.
being pompously pedantic is one of the things I draw a salary for. So
Well, actually, what's tender about it, genuinely for me, David, is when I was a boy, my mother, who is no longer with us, was a fierce reader of Reader's Digest. And it pays to enrich your word power. Every month was an exercise in which there were 20 words and their definitions corresponding, and you had to try to match them up. So
I remember that. My grandmother used to take the Reader's Digest too. My parents didn't, but my grandmother did. And when I was at her house as a small child, I would always go through those. Just that and the supposedly amusing anecdotes at the back. So
yes, that's right.
sent in by readers. Yeah.
So that was a monthly contest for me, and it was a big moment when sometime in middle school I was able to compete with my mother on those words. One of the things I wanted to ask you with respect to the caterpillar is perhaps the danger of superimposing modern, not symbolism, modern reality or experience onto the book, because you have a caterpillar sitting on a mushroom smoking a hookah, and there's a lot there that is imagery of our era with psychedelics and transcendental experiences. Any comment on that?
Well, of course, and that was I think one of the reasons why the Alice books enjoyed a slight resurgence in my youth. I mean, it's songs like White Rabbit by Jefferson Airplane and even that horrible Disney version of Alice in Wonderland came across like an acid trip gone slightly awry, and that was well before. And they made it, gosh, well before the vogue in psychedelics. And so, yeah, and Lewis Carroll. I mean, there is a certain kind of, I guess you'd call it an Orientalism there, I suppose, in the imagery of the impassive, the phlegmatic caterpillar smoking a hookah, and all that. And though he had no interest, as far as I know, in nitrous oxide or whatever, or opium or whatever else might have come his way at the time. He did, in later years especially, have a fascination with mysticisms of various kinds. When he was writing the Sylvia and Bruno books, in fact, uh, some of the influence was the sort of discipline of waking dreams that he had been experimenting with, but yeah, it's better not. I mean, of course, it depends on how you understand the act of reading, right? I mean, texts acquire meaning as time goes on and lose other meaning. Some become lost in history, too obscure to us to recover, or in some cases, they're jokes in the books that now require a sort of annotation to understand that would not have been lost on the original readers. One of my favorites is in Through the Looking Glass, when Alice can't get anything to eat at her own banquet because she keeps being introduced to the food. And after she's introduced, at one point, I think it was to the mutton. Now I'm getting old and forgetting these things. She asks if she can take a slice from it, and the queen says, "Certainly not. It isn't etiquette to cut someone to whom you've been properly introduced." Well, unless you have enough cultural knowledge to know that to cut is simply rudely to ignore someone you've met before, and there were different ways of doing this. You could do it subtly, or you could do it quite extravagantly. There was like the cut infernal, the cut celestial, the cut direct, the cut indirect. These were all forms of of premeditated social discourtesy. So, and, once you've been properly introduced to someone, you should never act as though you weren't. Well, a child can think it's funny that you shouldn't cut someone you've been thinking that means you shouldn't cut someone with a knife, but the actual joke is lost without an annotation. So the books lose some of their meaning with the passage of years. So they also acquire meaning within their contexts. Do you know the Borges story about Pierre Menard's version of Don Quixote?
I do not. I would love to be enlightened.
Well, Pierre Menard is rewriting, so to speak, Don Quixote, but he's actually just writing the exact same text, but ab origine, ab ovo. He's not copying it, he's writing it. He's going through this intense discipline of study and responding to the time. But the point of the story is that the text has ever so many more layers of meaning than Cervantes' version of Don Quixote. Even though the text is identically the same, it's written by a 20th century man, and so there are layers of irony and of experience and of sardonic distance from the action, and in the various ways that Don Quixote has been understood over the years. He begins as an object of mirth, of fun, but now for us, he's almost a saintly figure, the knight of doleful countenance, Unamuno's. Our Lord and Savior, Don Quixote de la Mancha, And so the text has a completely different meaning, richer layers of intertextuality and reference, but it's exactly the same text. And so if you can make a reading of the scene with the caterpillar, if you see resonances of the psychedelic there, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's someone else. Sorry to get so recherché here. The philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer?
Yes, I've heard the name.
Gadamer, okay. Well, he talks about the hermeneutics. When you're dealing with texts or cultural artifacts of the remote past, there has to be a merging of horizons. There's a kind of negotiation between your hermeneutical context and the historical transmission of the text. So, if we see that scene bathed in a somewhat prismatic psychedelic light that the original readers would not have seen, that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's just sort of another merging of horizons. Just don't let it ruin the childlike innocence of the text for you too, or don't turn it into a boring sort of Ernst Junger tract on drugs and their importance.
Yes. Word to the wise. Thank you. On that note, with respect to the Tea Party and the Mad Hatter, in the context of the time and the day in which that book was written, is there any connection there? I guess I'm curious how the Victorian mind might have seen that, and would it have been much as anything today that challenges false proprieties or piety in our world? Is that what was happening in any respect?
Again, I caution against overburdening the absurdity with messages. Now, of course, again, there's an example. We say mad as a hatter. This actually is not just a sort of meaningless phrase, obviously, in the 1860s when the first volume appeared, because hat makers did, in fact, employ chemicals that had a corrosive effect, neurological effect that could lead to dementia. So it was a perilous line of business to be a milliner, or a hat maker. I think, however, though, again, you've got the world of adults, the world of tea and cakes, a world that is shared with children. Everyone would have tea together. But what's going on at the table from Alice's perspective is not necessarily much more absurd and unintelligible than what actually is going on at tea time at the little house. She came from a very educated family. Her father was, in fact, one of the principal authors of the Liddell Scott Greek lexicon, one of the great achievements of classicist lexicography. So, I mean, she would have heard conversations going on at the table that would have seemed every bit as abstruse and fantastic and unintelligible as what's going on with the creatures at the tea party. And but then just delighted at the silliness of the dormouse. A dormouse is supposedly always falling asleep. The March hare, another image of madness. Because in March, hares are up and about and mad with passion, love, the sentimental creatures that they are. So, the absurdity still is, everyday experience, the world of adults, the expressions they use, filtered through the sensibility of a child for whom this is the universe she inhabits, but for which she doesn't yet have an index of interpretation. And so I think that, I mean, one of the things I love about the books is, though there's so much brilliant wordplay, and though it can only have been written by a very clever and educated man with an extraordinary capacity for uh, very rigorous logic, they also succeed, both books, at capturing some of the bewilderment of children. And, and I mean, to me, it's such a marvelous literary achievement that you can't imagine it being done better. And I obviously can't imagine it being done better because they are among my favorite books in the world.
Are there any scenes or sections that are examples to you of Carroll's genius, or the entire work, but perhaps any
Yeah,
individual?
I think every single scene is touched with genius in both books, but I think my favorite is in Through the Looking Glass, which is just the conversation between Alice and Humpty Dumpty. No matter how many times I read it, I find myself unable to suppress the laughter, and tears will come to my eyes sometime. And I cannot tell you how many times I've read it. Now, this is true of other scenes as well, but I just love that conversation. I love, and it's a perfect example, actually, of what I was talking about, because Humpty Dumpty is a character who is very pompous, very condescending to her, presents himself as an expert, but is obviously totally unable to. I mean, is obviously wrong about everything, again, to me, it's an absolutely brilliant depiction of how the world of adults seems to a small child, um, while at the same time having all the sophistication of Lewis Carroll's sense of humor behind it. So
Wonderful. Could we speak on Lewis Carroll's background or personal life a little bit, if you have any
sure,
interest or knowledge?
yeah,
Um, I'm just curious, in particular, people who have participated with this project that I'm doing of ongoing conversations will know that George MacDonald is a uh, very, very monumental figure in my own personal journey to comprehending the world and the nature of the divine and humanity. And I know that they were acquaintances, perhaps friends.
friends, very much so. Yeah.
Could you speak to that relationship at all?
Well, I mean, it's one that it can be reconstructed from correspondences mostly. I mean, letters. Um, but it they became acquainted with one another as adults. They hadn't known each other since youth, but in sensibility, they had so much in common. I believe, I may be wrong about this. My memory isn't as sharp as it used to be, but I seem to think that Lewis Carroll met MacDonald when he was in London for visiting a clinic for his tuberculosis. As you know very well, George MacDonald suffered enormously, though he lived, a long life.
Right.
Nonetheless, his pulmonary issues and his tubercular condition was quite grave, coughing up blood for much of his life. Um, and among the thing, I mean, obviously, uh, George MacDonald has few moments of whimsy like anything in Lewis Carroll. But they are both writers who write at their best. I mean, I'm not talking about George MacDonald's big novels of rural life and all that, but in his fantastical works and in his fairy tales, um, writing in a dream in a dream world, in a dream idiom. And they both had a genius for this in very different ways. They were both very devout Christians. Uh, they were both universalists. They believed in an ultimate reconciliation of all creation, not just all souls, but all creation with God. I would say, actually, there were things that united them to one another that they would not have had in common with just about any other of their acquaintances at the time or their literary colleagues, specifically theologically. And they both had a mystical bent, as you know. I mean, I don't mean that they went into their cells and experienced Oneo Mystica regular, but they both did believe that the world we inhabit is a sort of trembling veil hiding a deeper, richer, fuller, more glorious reality that's always pouring through. And I mentioned that late in life, that Lewis Carroll was experimenting with this sort of state of waking dreams. It was because he thought that these waking dreams pierced that veil in a certain way, and he was open to that. So, while I don't, whereas I don't want to burden, say, the Alice books, and when he did put more of that into his writing in the Sylvia and Bruno novels, the effects are mixed. But it's there, I think, even in Nietzsche in the Alice books, especially in Through the Looking Glass. Remember, it's written 15 years later than Alice in Wonderland. So a lot of time has passed, and he's deepened his thinking about a lot of things. And so you have the mysterious figure of the Red King, one of the most beautiful moments, really, to my mind, in children's literature, because it's so funny on the one hand, and yet so deeply, so profoundly suggestive, because the Red King is asleep, and he's dreaming the whole, right? And Alice is told quite clearly by Tweedledee and Tweedledum that she's only something in his dream, and that if he were to wake, she'd go out like a candle. Now, of course, as I say, he did have an interest in things Indian, and I think he may very well have been aware of, say, the iconography of Vishnu, God, as dreaming the world into being, and when Vishnu wakes, the world cycle collapses and begins again. But it's also just this an image that I think any culture can understand that has any but a purely rationalist or purely materialist or boringly mechanistic picture of reality. And then the Red King recurs as a theme in the book. First, just before she meets the White Knight, she thinks she wants to become a queen. She doesn't want to be just someone in someone else's dream. Right? But then at the end, the very last things she's saying, she's talking to her kitten, the kitten at the beginning that she was, and asking, what do you think, kitty? Because I was something in his dream, and yet he's something in my dream, and then. Finally, the question is that she asks at the end is, when will we find out who dreamt it all?
Mm.
And that is clearly, I mean, there is a spiritual significance to the figure of the Red King there. It's never heavy-handed. It's never ponderous. It's never overcomplicated, as again, things get in the Sylvia and Bruno books. But there you see it. And that sort of figure of the Red King in an amusing way is very much like the sort of, I don't know, the dreamlike figures in Lilith, say, or there's again that sense that inhabiting the dream world, in the dream world, you're actually more in touch with the reality of all things than you are most of the time in your waking consciousness when you're resisting this way of thinking, this way of seeing.
Yeah. Boy, thank you so much. I have much to ponder, but I will pause that for later in my mind, as I think one of the things that delights me about MacDonald and Carroll is they both give the clear understanding as you read them that they have not forgotten what it's like to be a child. in a way that, I suppose, would you be willing to entertain the idea that perhaps they even presaged what I would claim of the last 100 years is a very child-centric era relative to human history?
Yeah, and of course they lived in that era already. That begins really, in a sense, in the Victorian era, in which there's simply nothing. I mean, this is the great age of children's literature in Britain, especially since Britain, for whatever reason, has always produced the richest children's literature. And since that's a very high accomplishment indeed, it says something good about the British imagination or the British sensibility. That writing for children could be such a high literary vocation as to produce books like The Wind in the Willows or the Alice books or the Winnie the Pooh books,
Yeah,
But
go ahead.
it's funny though. I mean, I don't know. So I wouldn't say they presaged it so much as we're part of the first, let's say, the first full expression of a cultural moment that came into its own then. And of course, it was part of a greater social movement to end child labor and the imprisonment of children along with parents in debtors' prisons and other things of that sort, and also of any number of other social concerns of the time that were grounded in Christian sensibility of a very particular kind of not exclusively Anglican, but somehow oddly Anglican.
Would you care to elaborate for those of us who
Well,
are
remember
low
what's
church?
this is also, the great age of Christian social thought in Britain in reaction to the industrial age. It's the period of, whether heterodox or orthodox. I mean, people like John Ruskin, but F.D. Morris, another friend of Lewis Carroll and George MacDonald, another Universalist, an Anglican theologian of extraordinary
Can I
originality.
interject briefly?
Yep.
For many people who are unfamiliar with F.D. Morris, if you go to look him up, his last name is spelled Maurice. Just as a
Yes.
Please continue.
The British still pronounce the name that we pronounce in the French form, Maurice, correctly as Morris, and that's true as a surname as well as a Christian name. So yeah, F.D. Morris, and others in the Christian socialist movement, and so a concern for the welfare of children as a spiritual and political and social issue was very much on the rise at the same time. And so this sort of deeper and serious concern for books for children, books about children in which children are the protagonists in a real sense, in a way that goes beyond the mere fairy tale, the good children, Hansel and Gretel or whatever. But instead, a figure like, say, Diamond in At the Back of the North Wind. There just aren't many child characters like that in the literature of the earlier period. I don't know how much I can add to it. I could just say that the 19th century was a period in the Anglophone world especially, but not exclusively there, because it was also a period in German culture when a sort of new sentimental cult of childhood was on the rise. When childhood became, something to be explored. In fact, we forget that until fairly recently in human history, childhood is barely recognized as a state unto itself. And there's certainly nothing like being a teen. I mean, you basically go from the age where you have to be protected and nourished to the age where you're expected to be performing an adult. You go into apprenticeship at an early age. If you're of that class, you'd be working the land from what we would consider fairly early childhood. But even in the entitled classes, we find it amazing when we pick up, say, Alexander Dumas and read him describing a 17th century character who announces he's a man on horseback, he's a fully independent chevalier, and he's 15 years old. So the notion of the gradual emergence from childhood into adulthood is a fairly late way of thinking about children in most of human history. And then what happens also in the 19th century is not only does the concept of childhood expand and deepen, but a certain inversion occurs between our sense of where wisdom is to be found and where it has been lost. It would never, in the ancient world, wisdom is the province of the old, not of the young. And that's still the case. The young are stupid, but childhood, let's say, comes before youth. The sense that in childhood, in the childlike, not the childish, the childlike, before pubescence, before the angst of teenage life and the self-deception that goes with it, there's a kind of original primordial wisdom that sees things as they are precisely because they haven't been clouded by concepts and expectations and the responsibilities that are heaped on our shoulders by the world around us. And so childhood becomes now a model of wisdom, a kind of critique of the absurdity. You see that in these Christian socialist figures too. I mean, they see this one. There's a great deal of aestheticism there, how artists see reality, but also, a sense that children too are a kind of perennial critique of the folly and pomposity of adult life. And of course, that also within a Christian culture harkens back to images of Eden, and childhood becomes conflated in our mind with a state of innocence, of paradise, of a moment before we distinguish between good and evil, because we didn't need to. Everything was good,
Right. Right. This has been so fantastic. I am so grateful for your time. I just have a couple final questions or comments, and then would love for you to share whatever else you'd like. I'm curious about the idea of this whimsy or nonsense or hilarity, of course, being its own tonic, but also as serving as a resistance to idolatry in our own personal world and the broader culture. Any thoughts on that? Am I on the right track?
Well, every culture has its own idolatries, of course. They're always fairly perfidious things. They tend to be possessions that can be stored up only at the expense of others. Things like the nation state in the modern age, the nation state as it now exists, as it began to exist around 1750. We see that definitely now. Power, the need to dominate, to the degree. Now, I don't want to idealize little children. I mean, Augustine is also right that there's anger and selfishness in children too, and that one baby maybe doesn't kill another mostly because he's not strong enough to do so. But that also is an exaggeration too. So I mean, don't give Augustine all the credit there, because it is true that when you have little children, as you know, you've had children, and my son is 26 now, so I can't say it's keenly something I remember yesterday, but when you really encounter innocence as innocence and find there that children also are capable of a spontaneous generosity and love, you see the way a child, loves not just his or her parents, but a pet or a teddy bear that it doesn't strike, it shouldn't at least strike us as absurd. It shouldn't strike us as something, oh, well, we'll grow out of that in time. Rather, we should look at it and say, that's sane. Okay? Whereas carpet bombing Gaza or Tehran or some other enemy that we've created for ourselves, and killing innocent people for geopolitical or ethno-national or financial reasons, is psychotic and evil. And yet we think of ourselves as the serious ones, the adults, the ones who have to deal with reality on its own terms. But we create that reality, whereas the dream world of the child is still half in and half out. I mean, it's a mistranslation of Australian Aboriginal ideas to speak of the dreaming, but my few friends who are of Aboriginal background say, well, they've adopted the notion because it captures the sensibility. So let's go with that. Is someone who's still half in the dreaming and half in this world. A small child, that spontaneity and generosity of nature is a real rational critique of the madness and cruelty that we take to be the real shape of things, or the inevitable or the necessary shape of things, and in which we willingly participate, in which we willingly reinforce. So yeah, I think one of the most powerful critiques of the will to power is the Winnie the Pooh books.
You've referenced them multiple times, so I would love to hear your thoughts on Winnie the Pooh, because I did not include Winnie the Pooh as part of this series, and I'm feeling quite chagrined for that.
Well, there are some real animals in Winnie the Pooh. There's a real rabbit and a real owl.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the characters are toys, but yeah, not that there's any great distinction there in the world of the 100-Acre Wood. You should find someone to talk about Winnie the Pooh, yes, because Pooh Bear is a sage. It's a Benjamin Hoff books, the Tao of Pooh and the Tao of Piglet. I recently did a translation of the Tao Te Ching, and after I'd done it, I went back and looked at those books. They're kind of silly, but I mean, they are. He uses Pooh Bear as an image of the Taoist sage, as having the mind that is not cluttered with false oppositions, that simply is, And Piglet is, the exemplar of virtue, or the power of the way, the de. Again, you can always overburden text with meanings. That's not what he did. But yeah, I think that the silliness of those books, the absurdity of, say, Winnie the Pooh and Piglet going out to capture a heffalump and trying to figure out what a heffalump likes to eat, and then Pooh Bear realizing that he's left his honey there in the pit and going for it. There's a genius there. And then you talk about having to leave childhood, having to leave the garden. There's no moment in English literature more touching than the final scene of the house at Pooh Corner, where Christopher Robin is now going to go away to school, and he has to put aside childish things. And so he's saying goodbye to Winnie the Pooh. I can still get choked up reading that. I really can. It's unbearably moving
as you describe it. Yeah.
It was really unfair of him. Although I have to admit, I used that as sort of, let's call it intertextuality rather than plagiarism. In Rollin and Moonlight, the scene in the garden where I'm talking to Rollin, the last conversation I have with him, the last line there, we stayed like that together. I can't remember. We stayed there together like that for quite some time. Is just a faint echo of the last line in the House of Pooh Corner. Somewhere, a boy and his bear will always be playing. And so it's obviously stuck with me. I mean, it has an emotional resonance that you would think is far in excess of what are these absolutely silly and delightful stories. But there's a real depth there too, a recognition that childhood is an enchanted moment in which the world is either something we're very confused about and have to emerge into adult reason, or the world is as we actually see it, and we will be torn out of it into the world of adult psychosis. And knowing which of those is the correct way of looking at it, or the more correct way of looking at it, is the value that these books have in our lives, beyond just the joy they give us and our children.
Yeah. The world remains enchanted and not just a means to an end.
Yeah. And that's also, by the way, why one should not be overly intent on symbolism, because, of course, the enchantment it says the beautiful, the good, the true, the whimsical, the ridiculous. These are good ends in themselves. They don't have to be justified in terms of a didactic subtext.
Amen. Amen. My last question, not to put you on the spot, and if not, it's okay, but I was curious if you had a favorite line or two of poetry from Lewis Carroll.
Well,
Or a
I
favorite
love all
poem.
of them. Well, I mean, we all, although I love them all, or the Lobster Quadrille is quite good. You can sing the Lobster Quadrille almost perfectly to the tune of the Ode to Joy, but try it sometime. Although you have to redouble one of the lines to make it fit perfectly, but that works. But it was brilliant in the slightly toasted gyre and gimbaled in wave. All mimsy where the boar goes and the mome wraths out grey. Beware the Jabberwock, my son. I could go on to the end. Through the whole play, but I suppose that's my favorite in the sense that it's the one I recite to myself most often on long walks, and it was certainly the one that Rollin liked best.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much, David.
Oh, it's good to talk.
Yeah,
thank you.
Today's episode of The Plunge is sponsored by Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the mome wraths outgrabe. Beware the Jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch. Beware the jub bird, and shun the frumious bandersnatch. He took his vorpal sword in hand. Long time the manxome foe he sought. So rested he by the tum-tum tree and stood a while in thought. And, as in uffish thought he stood, the Jabberwock with eyes of flame came whiffling through the tulgey wood and burbled as it came. 1, 2, 1, 2, and through, the vorpal blade went snicker-snack. He left it dead, and with its head he went galumphing back. And hast thou slain the Jabberwock? Come to my arms, my beamish boy. O frabjous day, callooh, callay, he chortled in his joy. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the mome wraths outgrabe. Thank you, Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll, for that phenomenal sponsorship for this week's episode of The Plunge. Can't thank you enough, Lewis. Thanks, Jabberwocky, for sponsoring today's episode of The Plunge.